Success and recognition came early for Elisabeth Frink. Her rare promise was apparent from her art school days, and the Tate Gallery purchased a bronze from her first exhibition at the age of 21, and while still in her 30s, she was awarded the CBE. These days, she enjoys an international reputation and has held exhibitions in many different countries. The city of Winchester provided a splendid open-air setting for her sculpture during the past summer, and this month she's a major exhibition in Montreal. Among her best-known works, which millions of people see and enjoy, are the Birdman at Manchester Airport, the Altar Cross in Liverpool's Catholic Cathedral, and the Eagle Lectern in Coventry Cathedral, a replica of which was commissioned for the Kennedy Memorial in Dallas. Over 30 years, Elisabeth Frink's sculpture has evolved through a series of powerful images. One early obsession was with birds of prey, and then, during a period when she went to live in France, she embarked on the series of human heads which many people feel are her most powerful works. First came the goggle heads, the thugs, the bully boys, the oppressors. In the last few years, since her return to England, the heads have changed. They no longer portray the aggressors, but their victims, men who have suffered and have been denied their human rights, but whose indomitable spirit has survived. Elisabeth now lives and works in the heart of the Dorset countryside, a beautiful and mellow setting for some of her own favourite work. Animals have always been an important part of her life and the inspiration for much of her art. She's devoted to her horses and rides regularly, and she has a new interest with her husband, which I once shared, racehorses. I spent a day in Dorset with Elisabeth. First we went into the garden to look at her sculpture.
I'm about to do in the studio now another standing figure, which would be different.
Were you trying to get any particular mood there?
No, I think this is a rather peaceful one.
Yes. Yes, he's very much at peace,
man.
isn't he, and
Yeah.
composed.
Yes.
Without
well, I think that was the beginning. Yeah, that was the beginning of the time
from.
when. Yeah, I think it was the beginning of the time when I did a lot of rather reposeful things.
Yes.
As opposed to now, my running men, which is one on the other side, there, which I'll go and look at, is very much different. It's far more.
Nice and sun. Oh yes.
I've done one since.
He's of a later period,
yes,
isn't he?
Well, 1978.
But I mean, a later sort of period of man. The other one looked an earlier man, somehow.
Well, I think here again, this is much more to do with human beings running, either away or to. I don't know if one's being optimistic to better things or away from one's being pessimistic.
Yes. He's got that same forward movement as your Madonnas.
Yes.
Then, as the autumn day grew chilly, we talked about her work in the bright modern studio where she spends her working hours. You know, Elisabeth, the first time I really focused on your work was at Coventry Cathedral. I remember going there for the opening and being taken round by Basil Spence and seeing inside the cathedral the most marvellous things, the Piper windows, the Graham Sutherland tapestry. And I was very struck by your lectern, the Eagle, and I've followed since then all your work in animals, and I've often wondered why you've picked animals to concentrate on at that stage rather than human beings.
Well, I think mainly my love of animals came from being brought up in the country, where I spent a lot of time looking at them in the wild. And they were the most immediate things near me, and I think all artists work from what they see and their surroundings. And in my very early work, they were the things that preoccupied me, birds and horses or things around me.
And still do, because I've noticed you've got horses and all sorts of animals. We've had some ducks walking up to the studio just now.
Well, it's marvellous to be in a landscape with animals, because I think animals are a very important part of man's life. And that is really why I sculpt them. They're not actually animals in the sense that they're strictly anatomically correct, but they're animals in relation to man. Man's friends have always been horses and dogs, and they have served him very well, I feel. And I think that they have been man's friend for so many centuries. Yes. And it's that that interest me rather than the social
Yes,
context.
I see that. But what strikes me, for instance, about your birds is when I think of a bird, I think of something with wings. But your birds actually don't have any wings. They've got legs, long spindly legs, but no wings.
I think that was a very difficult period for myself and a lot of people after the war, that I was brought up in the war, and I think I used the birds as a vehicle for all sorts of aggressive forms, aeroplanes, birdmen. They were all mixed up in my mind. So not only was I drawing them from nature as I saw them, birds of prey, ravens, crows, but I was also involving them into a much deeper thing within myself.
Yes.
And they took this rather fossilized quality, rather an ancient quality. In fact, they didn't have wings at all, but they stalked and walked about, and in a rather menacing way. I think really just purely from my own experiences during the war.
Well, they are menacing, I think, and that's also the thing that strikes me about the first heads of yours that you did, of these men with very strong, brutal faces, some of them with goggles on, who really strike one as being very sinister and very frightening.
Well, I started doing those heads when I lived in France. I lived in France for nearly 7 years in the south, at the same time as the Algerian war was raging away. And I think I was very conscious of the police and of the army and Algerian refugees. And of course we were very conscious from the news point of view of the Algerian crisis and Ben Barker. And I feel that anybody that wears sunglasses is hiding behind them. And they are sinister from that point of view.
It's sinister when one can't see people's eyes.
Exactly.
Would you say then that your work really is socially and politically motivated, as well as being what one could call strictly artistically motivated?
I think it's both, yes. Socially, from the point of view of my animals, I think that animals are a very important part of man's life, and I feel we don't actually treat them as we should. They are most important to us, and they're extremely vulnerable. They depend on their existence for us, and we're very gradually getting rid of a lot of animals in this country, and in our present existence.
But in your human heads,
yes.
These very brutal, dominating male heads, presumably those are the oppressors, and then you pass on, I've noticed, to another set of heads
yes.
who seem to me to be the oppressed. They're much calmer, they're much more beautiful.
They're more beautiful. I think what I meant to put over in these heads, they are a tribute to people who have died for their beliefs. I feel very strongly about human rights at the moment.
Yes.
And the fact that whether it's under communism or fascism or any otherism, that people are being tortured. The ordinary people, the civilian populations of many, many countries are undergoing this terrible repression because they don't happen to fit in with the regime at the moment. And these heads are a tribute to those people who died. I would like to feel that the calmness of these heads, yes. rather than a thug, is going to appeal much more to people's sensibilities. I think I would always find inspiration in the human head. In fact, I'm sure I shall go on doing many more, as I am doing, because I think all the human emotions go through the head. You look at a person and you can see their life there, their suffering, their joy, and everything else. And that is a very good vehicle for the sculpture.
You see, I seem to see a development in your work, that it starts off being very stark, and then gradually, it seems to me, it becomes more gentle, more serene. I'm thinking particularly of the sculpture you did of the shepherd and the sheep, which is beautiful. I was there, if you remember, at the yes. Unveiling of it by Yehudi Menuhin.
Yes.
And there is something that's very beautiful, very gentle, in a calm way. Do you think you're moving from a rather stark portrayal of human beings and animals to something that's softer?
That sculpture in particular was a result of, or reaction to, coming back from France, where I was doing rather different things. And my work started getting simpler. I think, funnily enough, since that time, my sculpture is now getting harder again. For about 4 or 5 years, during which time I did that sculpture, they were much gentler, and I think I was reacting against all sorts of things that I've been living through in France and also seeing.
But I've noticed another move in your work, that you start off by depicting maleness, and now you've moved to depicting femaleness, in that you're doing these Madonnas, which I think are very interesting, except they seem to me to be very vigorous ladies, And as I look at them, I wonder whether they actually would carry a child. They don't look to me like childbearing ladies, and I think it's rather important, at any rate in religious terms, to put the father, the mother and the child together.
Well, yes, I know what you mean. I wanted to get right away from the Madonna with the bambino, Renaissance times. I see her as the Madonna, or the mother, that has actually had her child who's grown up and gone from her. And she has lost him, and like many other mothers. I mean, I'm, in a sense, trying to unite her with women today.
It seems to me that your women are much less menacing than your men. Would that be a fair comment?
I'm very ambivalent about that because I've not really sculpted women before. And as such, it's a very new departure for me. I'm not sure whether I will actually sculpt any more women again, or maybe I will do another Madonna, because I find that the male form says everything I want to say much better than the female form. I mean, that's my point of view.
Well, I think it's interesting that you've gone through this series of images. You seem to work very hard at a particular image, then finally you exhaust that, and then you go on to something else.
Yes, I think most artists actually go through phases in their work, and they work through a series, some to a more or less degree. I tend to do a lot of sculptures on one theme, and then I move on to the next. It usually takes me about 4 years to work out a theme. I've been doing the other things in the meantime. I'm not just doing nothing, but while I'm doing the present theme, I'm probably involving another. In fact, the Madonnas are extremely new, and I'm not quite sure how far they will go yet.
I know you came from a military family. I think your father was a general, is that right?
He was a brigadier, and he was a cavalry officer before the war.
Yes.
Then he was in tanks. And so I had an army upbringing and many different schools all over the country.
In a way, isn't it a bit surprising that out of that background should have come this artistic talent?
Yes, I think it is. I think my parents were marvellous when they saw that I didn't want to do anything else but be an artist, and that they allowed me to go to art school as soon as I left my ordinary school. My grandfather, however, did do very good watercolours wherever he travelled on his holidays.
Yes, so, that's
so
come
there is art in the family to a certain extent, but never professionally practised.
I wonder, really, why you chose sculpture instead of painting, for example, or some other form of the visual arts. Did that attract you particularly from the beginning?
Not at all. In fact, I think sculpture chose me. It was extraordinary because when I went to art school to start with, I was convinced I was going to paint. And after a few months at Guildford Art School, there was an extremely good man, Trevor Tennant, who ran a marvellous sculpture department and was very enthusiastic. At the same time, somebody gave me a book on Rodin and Michelangelo, and then I had a little trip to Paris as a student and went to the Musée Rodin.
Oh yes, I've been there. I did exactly the same thing.
I was just so bowled over, and I suddenly felt that, that I wanted to be a sculptor, just like that.
Yes.
And I started immediately sculpting in a very small way, because I was an intermediate student. One had to do so many different subjects. But in fact, I spent more and more time in the sculpture department, and ended up by doing nothing else but sculpture.
I sometimes wonder why there are so many women sculptors and so few women painters. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I've often wondered. In fact, there are an enormous amount of art students now, women art students, who are doing sculpture. It is interesting because it's a terrible, hard life in a sense. Physically, it's a lot of work.
Yes.
And it's not really a very easy thing for a woman to do.
Yes.
I don't know what it is, or whether it's because Barbara Hepworth, in a sense, forged a great path for women sculptors, and Germaine Richier in Paris also, that since that time, maybe it's become
a possibility.
Yes, it's become much more a possibility for women now to do, in fact, with our present day living.
You mentioned Rodin as somebody who had influenced you. Another sculptor who I associate in some way with your work is Epstein. And I think of you as a sculptor rather in his vein, having religious and secular feeling there.
Yes, I think Epstein is not nearly as much appreciated as he should be in this country, because before Henry Moore forged a path, Epstein was there. Epstein was already making a reputation for himself in this country and causing a great stir. he was actually making the English public look at sculpture, which they'd never done really in their life before, not contemporary sculpture. I mean, he and Henry Moore, of course, but Epstein did an enormous amount to put sculpture before the English public. He was not really very admired at that time. In fact, he was often derided for his pieces. And I met him as a student, and he was an enormous help to me. I got to know the Epstein family. Yeah. And at that time, he used to have wonderful musical soirees at his house.
You went to those, did you?
Which I was invited to, and where he fed one and wined one, and one listened to wonderful music. And it was at that point that I started really being interested in classical music. It was a wonderful opportunity for me, and he was very nice to me.
But it was a more general cultural influence rather than a specific influence in your sculpting work.
Well, I admired his work enormously. I still do. I think his carvings are some of the most powerful things he's ever done. Yes. And some of his portraits of men particularly, I think, are wonderful. Yes. But as a general cultural influence on me, he had a great effect.
But now, what about more particular influences? You mentioned Henry Moore. Has he influenced your work, or is it of another sphere and field?
I think he influenced me in the sense that he was amazingly encouraging to me, because when I went to Chelsea Art School, Henry was still on the board, so to speak, and he used to visit us once a term, which was a great event. We used to get all our work out, and he'd come and spend the day there, and he talked to us all individually. And he was always extremely encouraging to me, and I got a great lift out of that, apart from admiring his work, which I like enormously.
In a way, his work is very different from yours, isn't it? It's, he's providing the landscape, and you're providing the figures, as it were, in the landscape.
I think of Henry's work as landscape in itself, which is rather monumental, which is wonderful. The actual influence of the work, I don't think he has influenced me, because we're totally different.
Would you say your contemporaries at the Chelsea Art School and elsewhere, have they had an influence on you?
I think it's a very difficult thing to say, because I was a post-war art student, immediately post-war. The art schools were full of people who had just left the services and were trying to catch up. And it was a very busy time and a very exciting time to be there. And for instance, my contemporaries at that time were Chadwick, Armitage, Butler, McWilliam, and they had all got their own style. We were all also put together as a sculptor of the 50s. Well, yet I was included in that group, but I was actually a generation behind them, in fact, younger.
Was there a group as such, or is it something that's been created by people looking back? People always like to create groups. I remember Cecil Day-Lewis telling me he never met Auden until later life, but he was always put in a group by critics and by
this is one of the worst things that can happen to an artist, to be lumped in a group. And this happens invariably because it suits them very well to slot somebody into a slot. In fact, we were all totally different in our work, and have gone on to be completely diverging and doing very, very different things now.
Well, I think you got out of that danger, I think, and established your own individuality.
Well, I like to think I have, but it's often thrown up at me, actually.
Yes, well, you throw it back at them.
Well, I hope so.
What about the actual techniques you use? When we think of sculpting going on, one has an image in one's mind of somebody with a great block of rock and wrestling with it and getting something human, something artistic out of it. What techniques do you use? Do you carve, or do you have some other?
Yeah, I used to carve at art school, but I very quickly took up the technique of building up in plaster direct, which in fact Giacometti started, one of the early people to do it in France. And I think I was probably one of the first few people to do it in England. Rather than working in clay, one builds up in plaster Paris direct on an armature, and then it is cast into bronze.
And what effect does that have on your work? Does it make it more flexible?
It makes it extremely flexible, and it's very immediate. The fact that you can build up in 5 minutes, it goes hard, and it's there.
Yes. And
you don't have to make another cast before it goes to the foundry. It is a material that you can carve equally as well as model. And I think its immediacy is what is attractive, because I work very fast as a result.
Yes.
But lots of people just after the war in this country started using it, and I started using it when I was at art school and completely gave up clay.
What I think a lot of people are interested in when they meet an artist or get an opportunity to talk to them is what sort of an actual life they lead, how you fit in your various responsibilities together? I mean, you've got a house to run, you've got a husband, you've got children and stepchildren. How do you integrate your day with your work?
Well, it's a lot of discipline, in fact. It is entirely discipline. I think every artist I know has a very disciplined routine. I get up very early in the morning.
What's very early?
Well, I like to get up around about 6.
Yes, that is very early.
In the winter, maybe about 7, because it's very dark in the mornings.
Of course, people are different, aren't they? I mean, some people are at their best in the morning.
Yes.
Others are better in the evening. I mean, some are larks and others are nightingales. I think I'm a definite nightingale.
I can't work at night.
You can't?
Absolutely not. No, I want to cook, sit around, listen to music. The morning's my best time.
And do you work solidly? You
Yes.
come into the studio and work away?
And I work right through, and I probably take a small break at lunch and go on in the afternoon for a bit.
Yes.
And then I just want to walk out of here and leave it.
Yes. Yes, I find that with writing, that
Yes.
I like to sit at my desk in the morning
Yes.
and do my writing as uninterruptedly as possible.
Yes.
And then one can go back for a bit, perhaps an hour or so later.
I think it's a very much an office routine. It's 9 to 5 sort of thing. It's
Yes.
essential.
Yes.
Because you're working on your own and you have nobody else that's going to come in here and say, look, you know, there are things to be done.
I'm interested in the whole relationship of the artist to society, and I wonder how you react to the public's reaction to your work. For instance, you've had a number of commissions, and I think in particular of an early work of yours, The Blind Beggar,
Yes.
which was put up in the East End
Yes.
of London. And I remember some comments being made by the local councillor saying they'd rather have a public convenience and rather spend £1,000 on that, and various remarks of that kind. Well, how do you react to that kind of attitude?
Well, of course, one's first reaction is to say, for goodness sake, let them have a public convenience. You know,
Yes.
if that's really what they want. And on the other hand, one sort of thinks, well, never mind, because sooner or later they might come around to liking it, which in fact did happen, and which in fact invariably does happen. I think it's part of our education system here that the English public are not very good at looking at art in general and the art of appreciating it. Although they should be getting better, because many hundreds of English people now travel abroad more than ever did before. And it is from travelling abroad that they see the marvellous art from Greece and all the ancient civilizations, which they can't fail to see and are interested in it. And it is through art that civilization has arrived. We have all the art in the past centuries, which have given so much to the people, and that we are still getting something from. And therefore, I think, from looking at the ancient civilizations, I hope that by looking at contemporary sculpture today, as it is going up, or contemporary art, that they will also learn to appreciate it in the same way, because
Yes.
it should be life-enhancing.
I entirely agree with you, and it was one of the things that I was hoping to move into when my career as Minister of Arts came to an untimely end. I wanted to concentrate very much in this year on improving art education in the schools,
Yes.
because that's the audience of the future.
Yes.
And really, with sculpture and architecture, you only have to look, that's all, but I think you have to direct children's eyes so that they see the thing, they look,
Yes.
and they don't see, in
Yes.
fact, what they're looking at.
No.
Well, I know you get a number of religious commissions, and I know your work not only in Coventry Cathedral, but your altar cross in Liverpool. Then there's that Christ figure in Birmingham. Do you find that you get into conflict with religious patrons because you've got religious views of your own?
Well, I don't think I've got particularly religious views of my own now. I mean, I was brought up as a Catholic.
Yes.
And I have very strong views on Catholicism now, and what maybe it does or it doesn't do with relation to human beings. And I think probably that affects my work when I do religious commissions. But I think really they're much more straightforward to do.
What it does do, I suppose, is provide you with, or provide the ordinary person with some kind of visual imagery about religion, which I
Yes.
think is very important.
And of course, I mean, my image of Christ, or my vision of Christ, is probably very different to what lots of other people's are. I think it's rather an interesting...
How do you see him exactly?
Well, I see him as a strong, physically strong man, but a very vulnerable one. which indeed he was.
Yes.
And
he was the man who was disposed of by others.
And it's a recurrent theme, is it not?
Yes.
That we're up against now in many ways of people who are being put to death.
Well, those are private commissions.
Yes.
But when I was Minister for the Arts, one of my greatest difficulties was to try and think of ways of helping the individual artist. And you can help the performing arts, you give them grants of money. But individual writers, that's why I was so keen on the public lending right, because that helped them. Individual artists and sculptors, how could one help them more?
Well, I think from the point of view of selling their work, it is very difficult for the English public to be able to afford to buy English art, because England is the only country in the common market that has 15% VAT on living arts, which is a terrible price. On dead arts, on a Rembrandt, for instance, it's only 15% of the profit or the margin.
It's a real disincentive. We certainly should abolish that.
It is a disincentive for people to buy because it costs enough in any case.
Well, I wanted the Treasury to abolish VAT on all the arts, but I'm afraid I never got anywhere.
And I'm afraid that a lot of people that have a little bit of money would like to collect, you know, it just puts the whole thing out of the question when they have extra added tax on top of that.
What other things could you do?
Well, I think the government could run a scheme, which they do on the continent, in France and certainly in Germany, where they have 2%, maybe it's more now, of a big government scheme, a building scheme, for instance.
Yes.
2% goes towards art, and that's a very painless way, out of millions.
Towards works of art for that particular building?
It can be sculpture, paintings, murals, any form of art decoration.
And I think that also, I think more scope for exhibition, because I think particularly a lot of young artists and sculptors, they don't have the opportunity to exhibit their work.
No, I think they don't. There are a lot of galleries in London, but there are never enough galleries, of course, for them all to exhibit. Although I think in a sense, actually for young sculptors and painters now, the exhibition, the possibility of exhibition is slightly easier than when I started. And so in that sense, it is improving a little bit.
Are we getting good young sculptors coming forward now in the art schools?
There are a lot of very good young sculptors, very interesting sculptors. And of course, they're working in a wide variety of materials too. Bronze casting is very expensive. In any case, the work they're doing is not necessarily lends itself to bronze casting. Plastics, welded metals, all sorts of different materials. They're very interesting.
Do you do any actual teaching in the schools?
I don't now. I did teach for 14 years, but I occasionally visit the one or two art schools, which I find very interesting. It's a way of keeping in touch.
Yes, I think I'm very keen. Another thing that I resented very much was the policy of local authorities of pushing out the practicing artists from the schools because they didn't have actual teaching qualifications.
Yes, because I think it's much more important to be taught by a working artist who knows the problems.
So on the whole, you're an optimist about the future?
Oh, yes. I'm optimistic. Sometimes I have pessimistic moments, but on the whole, I'm optimistic. Yes.
Well, I think hope is very important because every human being needs hope. And I think one of the great things about artists is that they do give hope to people.
Well, I hope so.